Chapter 2 of Faithful Presence is called To Change the World. So we've said that God works through faithful presence, but how does this actually happen? How does this actually work? And he starts with a story of a guy named Joe who becomes violent with his boss, loses his job, things go bad with his landlord, is evicted from his apartment, and the church kind of steps in and says, hey, how can we be present here? And they actually ask to meet with the landlord and with Joe and to listen to one another, and they actually start with reading through Matthew 18 on how to resolve conflicts, and they listen to each other. And for a landlord who wasn't a Christian, was surprisingly open to this whole process and saw and everyone saw and noticed something beautiful happening here. And it was this practice of reconciliation. It wasn't something that happened spontaneously. It was something that happened because people were present to God's presence in reconciliation. In this chapter, describes this twofold movement. So one is Great Commission, or the mission of God, Missio Dei, where God is at work beyond the church, reconciling the world to himself, but also in the incarnation. And God has come into the world, particularly in Jesus, to be with humanity and in everyday life. And in the same way, we are to inhabit our neighborhoods and be with people. So we list the 7 disciplines here in this chapter: the Lord's table, reconciliation, proclaiming the gospel, being with the least of these, being with children, the fivefold ministry, and kingdom prayer. There are obviously other practices for Christians, but these are lived daily, they are repeatable, and they are social. And all of them open space for God's presence in Christ to become real among us. Key to these disciplines is also submissions, right? These we mutually submit to one another and to Christ. So these disciplines create a space, again, for surrendering our control, working against the impulse to take control and impose our will upon situations. And when that happens, this new marvelous space is opened up for Jesus to become Lord. And when that happens, we can then tend to Christ's presence among us. So do these things just happen in the church? Do they happen out in the world? Dave also really wants to point out here that Christ's presence is at work in the church and in our homes and at work out in the world, in our neighborhoods. And the difference of these things, of acknowledging Christ's presence, isn't the space, but the timing. God rules and reigns over all things, but not everybody knows it yet. So he calls these the 3 circles in thinking about where these disciplines all take place and function. The first one is the close circle, not closed, but close, where Jesus' followers carefully discern together their submission to Christ and to one another under his reign. Jesus is the host and is at the center of this space where his presence is deeply known. Now, the dotted circle is hosted by us, disciples, where neighbors or strangers can enter in and watch what God is doing in this circle. And so gathering people into Christ's presence through these disciplines happens in this dotted circle. We're the hosts with one another and other people entering in. And then there's a half circle where Christ's presence goes with us into the many places that we inhabit with the hurting and broken of the world. We go as guests and we discern Christ's presence as guests. The question here isn't whether Christ reigns or rules or not, but if his presence will be welcomed. And one of the last note from this chapter is we can as a church function in maintenance mode, where everything becomes in this close circle and we're just maintaining what we have and who we are. Or we can function in exhaustion mode, where everything we do is just outward and we're not actually rooted in Christ. We end up just functioning as like a social or justice or peace movement without knowing whose we are or who actually rules and reigns over the space, where ideology can take over instead of Jesus. So each of these disciplines should relentlessly drive us to being faithfully present in all 3 circles. And that's the second chapter. Excited for next Wednesday,